Spelling your name.
Macklin Fleming, Macklin Fleming.
And your title when you were a justice?
Court of Appeal.
Okay, and the interviewers are?
Paul Boland, and I'm a justice on the Court of Appeal, Division 8 of the 2nd Appellate District.
And Larry Rubin, also Justice on the Court of Appeal, Division 8, 2nd Appellate District.
All right, we are ready to go.
Okay.
Oh, cell phones are all off, I trust?
Cell phones off.
Justice Fleming, Justice Rubin and I want to thank you so much for permitting us to join you in your home to talk about your life and your career in the law. You've had a remarkable career dedicated to the law, to public service, as both a lawyer and a judge, and also had a career that's been dedicated to improving the interests of justice. Tell us, if you would, at the outset, a little bit about the people, the events, and other factors which helped shape your life and career, just in a general way.
Well, my father was a lawyer and a judge in Hawaii. He ended up as governor for 9 years, but he held judicial office, so I always wanted to be a lawyer as I was growing up.
He was a governor of, while Hawaii was still a territory, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Back in the wartime, and 42 to 51. And he had been a judge before and a judge after on various courts, so I was also aiming to be a judge.
Your father served as a justice on the Hawaiian Supreme Court for some years. Is that
Yes, and he was governor for 9 years, from 42 to 51.
You were born in Chicago.
Born in Chicago.
And were you raised in Chicago? You mentioned a few moments ago that you had lived in Cleveland. Tell us where you were.
Well, I was born in Chicago. My parents went to Hawaii after my father finished law school. At the age of 6, they separated, and at the age of 7, I ended up, when my mother remarried, a businessman from Cleveland. So I grew up in Cleveland. Was away at boarding school for a number of years, and
What school was that, Justice Fleming?
well, I was 3 years in England, and then I went to Taft School in Connecticut, and to Yale for 7 years.
You graduated from Yale University in 1934, and then from Yale Law School 3 years later.
Yes.
And you have remained very closely associated with your alma mater throughout your life. Tell us about your years at Yale, both as an undergraduate and as a law student, and how your Yale experience influenced your life.
Well, I entered Yale in 1930 as a full paying student, and in 31, with the Depression, my finances collapsed. But with Yale help on scholarship, work programs, and other matters, I was able to stay there another 6 years. So I've always felt very grateful to Yale for that opportunity. And
What was your major as an undergraduate at Yale?
History.
And with a particular focus on American history, European history, world history, or what?
Well, maybe European history as much as anything.
And how did you happen to choose Yale Law School?
Because I was there and could get financial help easier. From there, I went to see the advisory officer who advises juniors or seniors about future programs, and said, well, I'd like to go to Harvard. That was the name school at the time, and she said, well, why don't you go to Yale? You need support, and you're more likely to get it there. And that seemed an irresistible argument.
Absolutely.
Very, very good recruiting.
Really, terrific, terrific.
What What classmates did you have at Yale Law School? Any of them you remain friendly with over the years?
Well, one called Oscar Rubhausen, who lived about it. He was a New York practicing lawyer. Others too, I don't recall the circumstances. But I started in New York, and about half or two-thirds of my class started in with, as I did, with one of the big firms in New York. So,
When you were an undergraduate at Yale, what were some of the activities that you engaged in as an undergraduate?
oh, I played soccer. I was on the freshman soccer team.
Any particular clubs that you belonged to?
No, I think I was pretty much engaged in making sure that I would have the finances to stay there.
And when you went to Yale Law School, what activities were you involved in there? Were you on law review, moot court, any other activities?
I might have been on moot court. I know I wasn't on law review. So
While you were at the law school, were there some professors and courses that particularly interested you and influenced your career?
well, Abe Fortas was teaching there, and I was very admiring of him. And after I started work, I worked in New York, large law firm for 2 years, and then went down to work for Abe Fortas. Most disappointing experience of my life. He was undersecretary, I think, of the Department of the Interior, and I found working in a government bureau to be ghastly.
What course did he teach you at Yale?
Oh, some civil law course. I don't remember the title, but each professor uses his own course to give you his thoughts of the approach to law, and it doesn't make too much difference what the subject matter is.
Anything you want to ask about law school?
Any other professors who you remember from that time?
Well, Thurman Arnold was very flamboyant, and Corbin on contracts was going strong. Did either of you go to law school there? Or?
We did
No.
not, no.
We certainly-
Well, he was
certainly
professor there for about 50 years or something.
What did Thurman Arnold teach? Because he was.
Oh, the art of advocacy. I've forgotten the title of it.
My wife, before she went on the bench, was a partner at Arnold and Porter.
Oh, well,
Los
a
Angeles.
very successful firm. Well, he was a man who threw rocks and stones at the traditional legal establishment, and he was the man who popularized the idea, I think, that law is only an argumentative technique. There really is no such thing as settled law. It's just what a lawyer can make stick in court.
How interesting.
Always fluid, it would seem. The law would always be fluid?
Yes. So that was quite a valuable part of my education there.
Absolutely. Now, after graduating from Yale Law School, you became an associate at Sylvan and Cromwell
Yes.
in New York. What led you to join Sylvan and Cromwell?
I needed a job.
Anything strike you from hindsight as to what was particularly attractive of Sullivan Cromwell to some of the other firms?
Well, they offered me a job. That's all I can say. Jobs were hard to get in those days. A lawyer didn't have the choice. The firms had the choices.
What type of practice did you engage in when you were at Sullivan and Cromwell?
Oh, clerking in corporate law. Partner would say, well, look up what the law is on such and such a fact situation.
Did you make any court appearances in New York during the time that you were at Sullivan and Cromwell?
Relatively few, but I think for 2 summers I was sent up for 4 weeks or so to work in the Legal Aid Society in New York, where we were in court every day. So that was a good balancing.
Was that while you were at Yale, or was that as part of the,
Sullivan and Cromwell.
and that was a program they had?
That was a program that I think had just gone into existence, so each of the big law firms would contribute a lawyer or so for 4 weeks or 3 weeks, and they would man additional public service
Well, that's impressive.
lawyers.
I don't know that we were aware that pro bono activity began at such an early part in our
I've never
history.
heard that.
That's very interesting. Tell us about, later on in your career, you wrote a lot about the profession and the practice of law. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Tell us what it was like to practice law in New York in the late 30s. Tell us about the collegiality in the firm. Tell us about dealing with judges, and tell us about the legal community a little bit in New York during that time.
Well, the firm that I went with had about 70 lawyers altogether, and there were 3 or 4 other firms about the same size, and then they ranged down to about 20 or 25. And the idea in law school, if you wanted to go to New York, was to get a job with one of those firms. They were very pleasant places to work for. They did corporate law. Sullivan and Cromwell had some international law and even offices overseas, which is fairly rare at that time.
Sure.
The young lawyers were assigned to particular judges or happened to work out with particular judges, and they would help with the research and maybe some of the preliminaries, and that was about it.
Did the young lawyers have much client contact at that time, Justice Fleming?
Not much, no.
And what about the court appearances were rare, if any?
On the part of a young lawyer?
On routine matters, I think rare, maybe twice a month or something, you might sit up there to handle a motion or get a continuance or something of that nature.
You mentioned a few moments ago when we were setting up that after 2 years you left Sullivan Cromwell to serve in the bituminous coal division, and as I understand it, you served as a counsel at administrative hearings that dealt with the regulation of prices. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What led you to take that position?
Well, I'd always been very much impressed with Abe Fortas, and I wanted to go down and work for him. It was a mistake as it led out. I didn't know the horrors of government bureaucracy at the time, but I quickly found out.
Tell us a little bit about your work at the bituminous coal division.
Well, there's not much to tell. They gave opinions on specific applications of the Coal Act to what the price should be in Mississippi and what it should be in Pittsburgh, and we worked out the legal problems to authorize them and drafted the orders that would regulate coal. The regulation of coal itself was a disaster, and as far as I could see, accomplished nothing, so it was a little disheartening to work for an entity that was going nowhere.
Did you maintain a relationship with Justice Fortas beyond your time in Washington?
Well, I don't know. I was just one of a number of people. After?
Yeah, afterwards, did you?
No. the afterwards came about. I was drafted in early 41 and spent 5 years in the Army.
You began as a private in the artillery, correct?
Yes,
And then you, when you left the service 5 years later, you had risen to the rank of captain and had been decorated for your service in France, Germany, and Austria.
yes.
Tell us about those 5 years in the service, what you did and how that experience shaped your life and your career.
Well, first it gave me a pretty good idea of how big organizations work, and how the chain of command operates, whether it's in a civil bureau or in this instance, a military bureau. It gave me some indication of how, even in the lower ranks, you can manipulate the system to your advantage. It gave me a 5-year experience of serving under orders, which I don't think I would have gotten in civilian life. And it gave me combat experience overseas for 6 months.
After the war concluded, you moved to San Francisco, correct?
Yes.
What led to that move, Justice Fleming?
I didn't want to go back to New York or Washington, and San Francisco. West Coast sounded like a good place to go, so I went looking for a job at the West Coast at the end of the war, but so were 100,000 other soldiers, and I never got one. So I was finally offered one in San Francisco, so I said, yes, I'll do it. And then just as I was leaving to bring my wife back, I got a call up and said the offer was off. So I decided, well, I'd made all arrangements. I'd come to San Francisco, starved to death for 4 years, but worked in 1948 at the Truman administration and got a job as assistant U.S. attorney
In San Francisco?
in San Francisco.
Were you doing, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, were you doing civil work or criminal work at that time?
Oh, something of both, but I got somewhat of a reputation there, and so that I became known as a trial lawyer. And then eventually in '54 I came down and started to do trial work for Mitchell, Silverberg, and Knupp when Knupp had a heart attack, and they had a series of antitrust cases going on.
While you were in San Francisco, you served as counsel for the ACLU in several cases, and one of them challenged the constitutionality of the church loyalty oath requirement. Is that correct?
I have a vague memory of that, but I've forgotten it. Did you find something in the books?
It was listed in your bio.
Oh,
that,
well.
that you had done that. And can you recall anything about that case?
Well, I think I won it. Probably.
That's what I was going to ask.
That's probably why I listed it. I've forgotten. I think some county had passed a law that required a loyalty oath, and so I successfully contested it.
Now, in order to prevail, how high did the litigation have to go? Did it have to go to the appellate level or Supreme Court level, do you recall, or was it resolved at the trial court level?
I think it went to the appellate level, but I'm not sure.
Interesting. You were somewhat active in the ACLU in Northern California, weren't you?
I guess so.
Has your view regarding the ACLU changed in the years since that early involvement?
Well, I think they get overly concerned sometimes. It's a useful organization to have around, but you can't follow them blindly in everything they do.
Do you recall how you first got started with the ACLU? What moved you?
Oh, I was active with a similar organization in New York while I was there. There were, I guess every town had one, and it was an offshoot from the practice of corporate law, which
You moved from Sullivan and Cromwell, where you're doing corporate law, and then at least part of your work in the U.S. Attorney's Office is criminal law. What was your reaction to doing some of the criminal law cases?
very exciting type of work. I was just there on assignment from my firm. I think the firms had all agreed to help out the U.S. Attorney's Office there with sending some of their younger lawyers up to the courthouse to help with their workload.
You mentioned that in about 1954, you moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles to join Mitchell, Silverberg, and Knupp. Was Justice Rubin's father at that,
Oh,
at
yes.
that point?
He had the office next door to me. And about once every 2 months, he'd come by with two little boys.
One of whom was Justice Rubin?
I guess so. I don't recognize him, though.
He now wears long pants. Tell us what it was like. Mitchell has been a firm that has always had enormously talented lawyers. Tell us what it was like to practice law at Mitchell in those days, and so tell us about some of the lawyers that you practiced with at Mitchell.
Well, they had a regular business practice, and also which included litigation, and I was mostly involved in litigation. There were about 30 lawyers there, I guess, and maybe 10 partners and 20 associates.
You were involved in antitrust litigation as well as civil business litigation?
Yes, yes. The first years I went there, they were heavily involved in defending motion picture antitrust cases. And that took about 2.5 or 2 years, and then I was involved in general litigation for the firm.
Part of the motion picture cases was antitrust as it related to ownership of movie houses by the studio.
Yes,
And
yes, precisely. And there was a long-standing suit going on. I spent about 1.5 years in that one court on this one suit. Finally, that was.
Which case was that, Justice Fleming? Do you recall who the parties were in that case and who the judge was in the court?
Well, I remember Homer Mitchell of O'Melveny and Myers was there, and he had an assistant who later became Secretary of State.
Warren Christopher?
Warren Christopher was there, and we represented Columbia, the Little Three, Columbia at that time, Columbia United Artists, and one other, the major.
RKO maybe?
Yes, RKO.
And was this litigated in federal court?
Yes.
Do you remember who the judge was?
I remember the judge, but I can't remember the name.
Tell us anything else you can remember about Mitchell Silverberg in those days during the 10 years that you practiced there.
Well, it was 6 years.
6 years.
5 or 6.
Yeah.
Well, it was mostly a transactional firm, and the litigation was a relatively small part. The antitrust just happened to be against their clients. And I did a lot of work for Columbia Pictures, and became very friendly with the head of Columbia Pictures, Harry Cohn, who took an admiration to my work. And so even after the antitrust business left, I was still doing a lot of work for Columbia Pictures.
He was a man known for having strong views. Did you
Yes, and
experience that?
supposedly quite disagreeable, but first time I went to see him, I got all the papers together relevant to the point I was going to talk to him and sent them to him a day in advance, and also an outline of what the papers revealed. And he became my friend for life. He said that's the first time anyone had ever done that to him, and so I was a made man.
That's true. Tell us about, we're going back some 50 years. Tell us what the practice of law was in the Los Angeles community during that period of time. It was a much smaller legal community. What can you recall?
There were 2 or 3 or 4 big firms, and the rest were individuals of 1, 2, or 3 or something like that. The big law firms controlled all the major motion picture business, and that meant that the smaller individual firms were sort of mostly anti-firms, always stirring up trouble, as I saw it, representing the big ones. As far as I know, the practice was not too different from what it is. A few large firms dominated the practice, and there were scattered individual firms. Some did trial work, and some did certain types of defense work, and I doubt that it's changed very much since then.
During the time that you were practicing at Mitchell, you also became involved in Democratic Party politics.
Yes, well, I had been involved before, yes,
And you served
up in San Francisco.
You served as a delegate to the alternate delegate to the 1956 Democratic Convention
Yes.
that nominated Adlai Stevenson and
Yes.
Estes Kefauver. You were chair of the Lawyers Committee for Stevenson that year in his second run for the presidency. And then later on you chaired Edmund G. Brown's Policy Advisory Committee. Tell us what led to you becoming involved in Democratic politics originally, and what caused you to remain involved during that time period.
Well, I always wanted to be a judge. My father had been a judge, was a judge. So the way to become a judge was to get involved in politics on the winning side. So I had some sympathy with the Democrats, so I got my first job as assistant U.S. attorney by actively campaigning for Truman when Truman seemed like a certain loser in '48. And then I came down here. I remained active in politics, and particularly in the cause of Edmund G. Brown, who I first knew as Attorney General in San Francisco, and then he got elected governor, and eventually he appointed me to the Supreme Court down here in 1960.
Did you get to know him personally?
Oh, yes.
With him?
Yes.
What was he like?
Oh, he was a wonderful man. He could have been president with some other luck and the way the political chips scatter around. So he was really a first-rate man. I never had the same respect for his son, who's a different sort of person.
Mm-hmm. Well, during the first year of the Brown administration, you were appointed to the Los Angeles Superior Court.
Yes.
And were you one of Governor Brown's first appointments to the Superior Court?
Pretty much, yes. I think they increased the court to about the size of 12, and I was among those. So I had organized the Lawyers Committee down here for Brown when he was running. And I guess one of my claims to fame is that I recruited a man to my committee to help Brown, who later became Secretary of State. So of the United States.
Warren Christopher?
Yes. So I got him interested. He was working for a big downtown law firm.
Was he working for O'Melveny?
Yes.
Then too?
Yeah, and I got him active in the Democratic cause. And
What was the political process, if you recall, for appointment to the court back in the 50s?
friend of the governor, period.
And at that time, you did not have to go through a state bar evaluation process.
No.
Is that correct?
No.
Was there any kind of screening that occurred, Justice?
Not that I remember, but there may have been some perfunctory screening to see that you hadn't been indicted or something like that. But I don't recall screening as a big factor. Is it now? They turn a lot of them down? Or?
Yeah, both informally and formally. The state bar has a formal screening.
No, they didn't have anything like that. Well, do they actually turn people down at the governor? Or does he
usually
clear it in advance?
It's more that. Clearing it in advance, getting their input before he makes his final decision.
The governor's office may send a number of names to the state bar
Yeah.
for an investigation, and the state bar then conducts its evaluation and decides who to recommend to the governor and who not to recommend, and the governor usually follows those recommendations.
Is the job eagerly sought these days?
Yes.
I think so, definitely.
So the pay is relatively all right.
I think that there is a greater pay differential between private practice and the bench now than there probably was when you joined the court. What did a superior court judgeship pay when you joined in 1959? Do you recall? Roughly?
It was $20,000 or $25,000, which was exactly the same as I was getting working for the law firm.
That's remarkable.
Well, that was
Because that does not.
10,000. Congressmen were getting $10,000 a year, and about that time or so, maybe they'd gone up a little bit. So that was the prevailing.
Because now almost anybody who joins the bench takes a significant salary cut.
Correct.
But they still get the people they want to get, or
Oh, I think so.
I think so.
well,
I hope so.
you have a fine pension, and
You do?
your wife gets a pension, and
Who were some of your early colleagues on the Superior Court who you were close with? Might have been appointed around the same time you were, or you got to know.
when was Eddie Rubin appointed?
No,
Was Otto Kaus?
Otto Kaus might have been.
Yeah, he was a contemporary,
with you?
maybe one of the same batch at the same time when I was appointed.
Tell us about some of the judicial assignments that you had on the Superior Court. Where did you sit? Criminal, civil, other assignments?
Always in civil.
Always in civil. You never served in criminal. Huh?
No, I might have had occasional criminal case or so, which overflowed from them, but no, that was not considered a desirable assignment. Is that still true?
Well, I think there's such a mix of people on the Superior Court. Some would prefer criminal and others would prefer civil.
But I think now, even an attorney who had been a civil practitioner now is likely to spend a couple of years at least hearing criminal cases or juvenile cases or family law cases before he or she moves to a civil assignment. But if somebody has been an active civil practitioner, he or she will probably get to civil eventually.
Well, the criminal time I was on the bench, the criminal bench was considered a step down for the slow pokes.
Were there any cases that during the 5 years that you sat in the trial court, were there any cases that were particularly memorable that you had?
Well, not memorable. I can't think of any now.
Did your judicial philosophy or your views regarding judicial administration shaped at all? To what extent were they shaped by your trial court experience?
Well, in those days, every trial judge was pretty much on his own and ran his own ship. I don't know how it is now, but I suspect it's much more regimented now. And there were some loafers on the job, but usually they ended up in the criminal courts where
You were not one of those loafers.
I was never assigned to the criminal court, no. I suspect things haven't changed too much.
The criminal courts were in the old building at the time, where the jail was. Is that, do you remember that?
The criminal courts were in a separate building,
Sure.
and even the building was a little run down, so.
When you sat in civil, you sat in the existing county courthouse, is that correct? Which was a relatively new courthouse at that point. Is that correct? Or did you say?
Well, I think a new one was being built, and there was a period of time when we occupied office space in the mid-Wilshire
Okay.
district where the courts were, the appellate courts, that is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, after 5 years on the trial court, the governor appointed you to Division II of the Court of Appeal, where you would serve for 17 years until your retirement in 1981. What led you to accept an appointment to the Court of Appeal after 5 years on the trial court?
Oh, it was a step up, and maybe a path to the Supreme Court or a path to the federal court. Federal court had a great deal more prestige then than the state court. I guess it still does, doesn't it? Or is that?
Well, I think
Has that gap narrowed a little?
I
Or
think that my wife is a federal judge, and I think that gap has narrowed somewhat.
is the
because
pay the same? Or?
the pay is comparable, but the caseloads in federal court now are discouraging a number of people who might ordinarily have applied to the federal bench.
It's no place for an easy early retirement.
It is not an easy place. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Did you take any affirmative steps to consider the federal court?
Well, my connections were all statewide, and when it came to federal, I didn't have much going for me. I took what steps I could, because at that time the federal court had a great deal more prestige, but I was never successful. At that time, it was almost exclusively a senatorial appointment. He could appoint almost, he or she could appoint almost anyone they wanted to the bench, and they would be confirmed. So I didn't happen to know any senators. I never got very far on that line.
More recently, the confirmation hearings for federal judges, for example, have become acrimonious and very political. Do you have a sense of the impact that has had on the judiciary?
No, I don't, because I've been retired now, completely retired for 5 years. After I retired from the bench, I maintained the law office and kept some contact, but no more, so I can't help you on that at all.
Let us ask you, if we can, about your 17 years on the Court of Appeal. You published hundreds of opinions. Do any of those opinions stand out from your perspective as you look back?
None of them come to mind readily, but that's some time ago, and the world moves on.
how did during your 17 years in Division II, there were some justices left, some new justices came. How did the character of Division II change during that period in terms of, say, judicial philosophy, personality, work ethic, collegiality?
I don't recall anything specific on that subject. The character of the Supreme Court changed quite a bit during those years.
Sorry, I was just going to ask you to pause and change tapes real quick.
Yes, I think it's almost a necessity. And particularly appointments to the Supreme Court, which tend to be, sometimes come from outer space.
You mentioned a few moments ago the Supreme Court and how that had changed a lot. Did you ever express an interest in a Supreme Court appointment?
Yes. Did I ever get any results? No. Well, I sat there probably for a total of 4 or 5 or 6 months over the course of the years, as there were vacancies, and then there was some sort of turmoil in the governor's office, and I think I sat there for 3 or 4 months at one period.
How was that experience sitting on the Supreme Court?
Oh, fine. It's not all that different from sitting on the appellate court.
Who was Chief Justice during that time period? Roger Traynor?
Part of the time, yes. Who was his successor? I don't know.
Donald Wright, I think, was his successor. Is that not
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, he was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Both of them.
Tell us a little bit about your relationship with some of your colleagues on the Court of Appeal. We know that you were, as a member of Division II, you worked with Justice Roth, Justice Roy Herndon, Justice Lynn Compton, Justice Edwin Beach, and perhaps others, and there were justices in other divisions. Did you have close relationships with other justices in the Court of Appeal, either in your division or in Los Angeles during that time? Who were your...
Well, I know I had close relations with the members of my division. I always had a great respect for Justice Roth, who had a distinguished career as a trial judge himself. And Herndon was a good lawyer. As you know, the appellate judge sort of sits there in his office all alone most of the time, reading papers and writing opinions, so I don't think collegial is quite the same as lawyers who practice and maybe appear to court together.
Did the judges ever get together socially? The justices ever get together socially on the court at that time at all?
Not much, no.
Did they meet to discuss policy issues? Did the entire court meet to discuss administrative issues?
No, I don't remember any such meetings. It would have been very unwieldy because of the number of judges involved and their scattered locations.
We now have, as you know, we now have 32 justices in the Second Appellate District, and we have an administrative presiding justice who happens to be Roger Boren. Before that, it was Charles Vogel. Was there an administrative presiding justice in Los Angeles when you were on the appellate court?
I don't recall one.
In your division, would you meet prior to oral argument to discuss your cases?
Well, we would get the briefs and read them. No, I think we'd wait for moral argument and then meet afterwards. Might have been some exceptions to that.
Did you, at that time, did you prepare draft opinions prior to oral argument and circulate them to your colleagues?
Before oral argument?
Yes.
No. We might have had law clerks who prepared
A bench memo of some sort?
memo, and it's possible that in prominent cases, sometimes those would be exchanged.
Now we are required to, after oral argument, we're required to file the case within 90 days. If we don't do that, we don't get paid. Is that true?
I think that was true. Maybe it was 60 days or something. Anyhow, I always got paid, so.
That's a good sign. Any memorable dissent or disagreement in a case that comes to mind?
Well, one or two, but I can't remember them. Occasionally, I remember a case that went up the United States Supreme Court, and my opinion was affirmed over the opinion of the Supreme Court, but I can't remember the facts, so
Right.
I just remember the vindication.
That's a good feeling.
One of the articles of yours that we read was a 1975 judicature article entitled "The Price of Perfect Justice."
Yes, and I wrote a book.
We know that.
Yeah.
And in The Price of Perfect Justice, you argued that the criminal justice system was being paralyzed by a proliferation of procedural safeguards. To what extent did that frustration with and those concerns about notions of perfect justice influence your judicial decisions as a member of the Court of Appeal?
Well, I decided to determine promptly every case that was submitted to me. I think that was about all. That sort of argument is like a voice in the wilderness that makes a faint wail in the distance and nothing changes. I imagine that's still true today, isn't it?
One of your other books was of crimes and justice, where you spent a lot of time with the theories of punishment. Any reflections on that as you sit here today?
Well, I'm lost touch with that area of the law, so I really don't know what's going on these days. Is there a more balanced view these days?
I would say since you retired, there was more of an emphasis on punishment, and in the last 2 or 3 years, it's swung back a little bit more into rehabilitation.
Agree.
So I think there's a
Switches from one to the other.
It does.
It does.
Are you both judges on the same division?
Same division. There are.
And how is the state Supreme Court doing these days?
They've been pretty good to us.
Is the governor making pretty good appointments?
Oh, I think so.
Yes.
We had some wild appointments while I was on the bench, and
We have both, as you did, we have both sat on the Supreme Court by assignment, and I think we have been struck by how centrist that court is by and large, but also struck by how collegial a bench it is.
Good.
And I think for each of us, it's been a very pleasant experience.
Good.
Positive experience.
It really was.
Good discussions among
Absolutely.
justices.
Absolutely. You wrote another judicature article back in 1969, in which you said that the litigation explosion threatens to overwhelm existing institutions and cripple the business of the courts. And you argued that increasing the number of judges and courts does not provide an adequate solution. Instead, you proposed a reorganization of the courts. You proposed the routine handling of certain kinds of matters, And you also argued in favor of the elimination of certain procedures. As you know, in the years since that article was written, it has seen the continued expansion of the number of courts and the number of judges, but it's also seen the introduction of ADR and complex litigation courts. Do you have any sense that the expansion of ADR and the creation of these specialized courts has responded to some of the concerns that you expressed 4 decades ago?
Well, it sounds like it, but since I closed my office 5 years ago, I'm completely out of touch with the legal world, and I don't have much of a development of what's going on. I've always felt that the Court of Appeal was sort of a fifth leg, and that the state should try and work towards a development of a two-court system instead of the three-tier system, which takes all that much time. I think New York's appellate division disposes of matters quicker than the Court of Appeal does, because it's a easier access, and getting up makes things more easy to get up to the Supreme Court. So that would be a continuing. You say there's 64 appellate judges just in Southern California?
32 in the greater Los Angeles area.
I see.
And nearly 100 statewide
Well,
Court of Appeal justices.
the ideal system, in my mind, would just be to have a two-court system. You have your trial in the Supreme Court and issues a judgment, and then you have a Superior Court, and then you have a review in the Superior Court, and then the other could take it quickly, but I haven't heard any great outcome for that, so I guess we still have this three-tier court, which statewide, how many appellate judges are?
About 100.
Well, I think a system could be worked out where the trial court would have an immediate appellate rehearing or something, and that would be it. But
Have a trial division of the court and an appellate division of the same.
well, judges would do both, back and forth, and it would be an elaborate rehearing, I think. But printed briefs and all that would.
So it would not be a full-blown appeal.
No, particularly with all of the apparatus that goes with a full-blown appeal. But that's for you gentlemen to work out in your spare time.
We'll try to work on it. You know, as one who you served for 22 years as a member of the trial and appellate benches, what would you like the judiciary, the legal community, and the general public to remember about you and your role as a judge, your work as a judge during that time period? What do you think stands out as most significant?
Well, judicial restraint, I think, was at that time the judges tended to decide everything that anybody brought up to them. And I don't know how it is today, but the lack of judicial restraint was the most, as I saw it, the most worrisome problem in my time.
What led you, do you think, to develop that judicial philosophy?
Oh, the lack of merit in a lot of the cases I saw.
Let's, you retired from the bench in 1981, just about the time we came on the bench.
That's true.
And thanks for making room for us.
Oh,
But
So you are preparing a booklet or a memo, and it'll be circulated to all incoming judges
Yes.
as to what is expected of the courts and what they've.
And also to be kept as a permanent record in the Supreme Court Library as well.
After you,
How are the appointments in the last 10 years to the Supreme Court? Have they been up to snuff, or?
I sure hope so.
I think so.
They have.
I think so.
Good.
We have both sat pro tem on the Supreme Court, and we're very impressed with their collegiality, their centrist, their dedication.
They went through a rough time at one period or another when some,
During the Rosebud period.
yes, when some not very competent judges sat on there.
Right? We do not have anything like that now.
Go, good.
Since your retirement, and what have you been doing outside of the law? Yeah, I know you play tennis.
Play tennis. For a while I did some gardening. I don't do much of that anymore. Sleep about 12 hours a day.
Sounds good.
Stay alive.
During your long and distinguished career, you also maintained a full and active family and personal life. And as we understand it from your biography, you and Ms. Fleming have been married almost 65 years.
Yes.
And you raised a family of 3 children.
Yes.
Tell us about your life, a little bit about your life away from the law office and off the bench.
Well, it's been very happy. Married a wonderful wife. I hope everyone else can do the same.
What have been some of your activities off the bench besides tennis?
Well, almost for 30 or 40 years, I think we took a month's vacation and traveled to Europe, Australia, Far East, all over the world. We routinely go overseas for about 4 weeks. And
Have you been involved in the arts or theater or music at all?
my wife has been very active in that. And yes, there have been several social organizations in which I once was active.
Anything else that you'd like to tell us?
Well, I wish you both good luck in your professional career and your personal lives.
Thank you very, very much.